So welcome to those listening again on the recording, and welcome again to those joining live. You're joining Hope in Action, Beyond Narratives of Us and Them. I'm Flo from the Network of Wellbeing, and I'm going to hand over to Georgie at Resurgence to share a bit more about this event.
Thanks, Flo, and welcome everyone. This is our 5th Hope in Action event, and this series seeks to support hope in uncertain times and nurture positive actions for personal and planetary well-being. We'd love to connect with you during this event and afterwards, so for those of you that would like to, you can use the hashtags Hope in Action Events or Hope in Action to share highlights and thoughts and connect on social media during and after this event. As Flo briefly mentioned, this series is hosted by the Resurgence Trust and the Network of Wellbeing. The Resurgence Trust is an educational charity for ecological regeneration, social justice and spiritual fulfillment. And it seeks to inform and inspire change through its events and publications, the Ecologist news platform and Resurgence and Ecologist magazine. The Network of Wellbeing is all about building well-being together, and in their work connect people, they support projects and inspire action for the well-being of people and planet. And they do this through their events, network building and community projects focusing on putting well-being into practice. So that gives today's gathering a bit of context. And before we launch into our hearing from our speakers, we'd really like to run a brief poll to kind of find out how you're relating to this topic as we embark on this journey together. We've got about 85% of the results in, and it's looking as though the majority partly feel that they mainly interact with people with whom they agree, so that's about 43%. Yes is 33% and no is 24%. And do you find yourself speaking or thinking in us and them terms? Majority 62% say yes sometimes, 21% yes often, and 17% rarely. And you will be able to see those responses on your screen now. So it's really interesting to find out how you're feeling about this way of interacting with others and this feeling of us and them. And so with that in mind, I'm very excited to hear from our speakers on this topic. So I'll hand over to Flo to lead us into that part of the event.
Thanks so much, Georgie, and thank you everyone for taking part in that poll. It's just to start getting thinking about how we relate to some of the issues that will be touched on this evening. Just a very small practical issue before I introduce our first speaker that was raised in the chat by Rona about the closed captions option. So if you would, we've enabled closed captions. So if you would like subtitles based on what's being shared in the event, you can enable them yourself if they're not appearing automatically by clicking on the CC at the bottom of your screen, just to let you know. And if you have any issues, feel free to share in the chat. We've got our team that can help out if you're having any challenges. So now I would love to introduce our first speaker, who is Alex Evans. So Alex is the founder of Larger Us, which works at the places where our states of mind and the state of the world meet to build a larger us rather than a them and us world. So you can see how he's perfectly placed for this topic this evening. He's also a senior fellow at New York University's Center on International Cooperation and the author of The Myth Gap: What Happens When Evidence and Arguments Aren't Enough, which is a book about the power of deep stories and how they unlock systemic social and political change and how to address a world of increasing them and us identities. So Alex, really pleased to have you here with us, and over to you.
Thanks so much, Flo. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. So as you've just heard, I am with an organization called Larger Us. And Larger Us is really a community of people who in all sorts of different ways are working for change, but are united by two ideas in particular. And Flo's just said what they are. The first is that right now in particular, we need to come together as a larger us rather than fragmenting into a kind of polarized them and us. That's absolutely key to achieving breakthrough outcomes on issues on the scale of climate change, for example. And the second thing, the second idea right at the heart of our work is that that is as much about psychology as politics, that this has to do with our state of mind as well as the state of the world, and that actually the feedback loops between the two are really important and something that we need to get much better at navigating in order to be 21st century change makers. Now, where Larger Us began really for me was that a few years back, I was working with an organization called Avars, which you may know of. It's a sort of huge global online citizens movement. And as a campaign director there, I was running Avars's Brexit campaign. And obviously you couldn't work on Brexit back in 2018 without realizing that the polarization on this issue was completely toxic. It felt less like a normal political issue and more like a kind of septic wound in our politics. And while I was doing that work, I was especially interested in Cambridge Analytica, if you remember them. I mean, there was a lot of hype at the time, some of it overdone, about what they were seeking to do with this kind of mashup of social media micro-targeting and psychological profiling. But I was fascinated by the way that they were, in effect, trying to weaponize our own anxieties against us, to prompt a critical mass of us to see the world in them and us terms just when it really counted in the middle of an election campaign. And I became really fascinated with the question, well, what would it take to kind of inoculate societies against this kind of deliberate weaponized trolling? Because that seemed a really important thing for the future of democracy. But the other thing I realized while I was doing that work at Avars was that I was also part of the problem, that me and kind of other people working on Remain-leaning campaigns, and indeed people on the other side of the debate working on Leave-leaning campaigns, we were all contributing to this polarization. And that was quite an uncomfortable realization for me, that I sort of liked to see myself as a progressive campaigner, but actually I was widening divides rather than bringing people together. And those questions that started for me with Brexit have just kind of grown in my mind, because they seem especially apposite on the issues that we're up against now, like climate breakdown, like migration and refugee rights, like international development, really huge pressing issues, which in some cases have already become highly polarized, and in other cases are at acute risk of becoming polarized. And I'm thinking particularly of climate change here. We can see how people on the far right of politics are deliberately trying to polarize the debate around net zero, because they understand very well that that will block prospects for truly transformational breakthroughs. So the question right at the heart of our work at Larger Us is, well, what's the kind of alternative to playing that game of sort of doubling down on the polarization? Is there a playbook that we can start to develop together which gives us different options? And that's really what this idea that we're fascinated by of larger us change making is all about. We're imagining a kind of change making that sets out to bridge divides rather than deepen them, that thinks of victory less in terms of defeating an enemy and more in terms of transforming dynamics. And also that recognizes that doing this is often emotionally demanding work, and therefore that there's kind of inner work that it involves for each of us as change makers. And really briefly in the next 5 minutes, I'll just rattle through 5 questions which we think are right at the heart of Larger Us change making. The first one is all about how we build belonging, because we're fascinated by the psychological evidence that exists to show that when we feel lonely, that makes us less good at being citizens. For one thing, we become more self-centered and less empathetic. For another thing, we become more at risk of being drawn into extremism. So when change makers manage to build belonging through their work, the kind of belonging that welcomes people in rather than being based on who's excluded, that's incredibly powerful. It's such a gift to society. It sort of enables us to be better citizens. And it's also the kind of glue that makes movements last for the long term, when people feel like they belong and they're seen and they're valued. So that's the first question. How can we build belonging through our work as change makers? The second one is all about how we can bridge divides rather than deepening them. And this is partly about the fact that it's very easy to build resonance campaigns by othering people. I mean, them and us dynamics are just, they're great for firing up supporters, for getting media coverage, for getting funders interested, but it does have the effect of deepening these divides that may in the long term make our work more difficult. The risk is of kind of winning battles, but losing the war. So we're really interested in theories of change which overcome that, which bridge these divides. And one example of that is the kind of whole field of courageous conversations, of being able to do that nonviolent communication that's based on really deep listening, as well as on kind of showing up emotionally with kind of emotional disclosure. And there's great examples of how people are starting to use that in campaigning to bridge divides, to reach across the political spectrum, rather than just firing up a kind of narrow base of people who already think the same way that we do. The third question we're really interested in is how we can appeal to love, not fear, in our work as change makers. And this is particularly about what happens when we feel threatened. You probably know about the so-called fight, flight, freeze threat response. And it's something that's really effective at keeping us safe. You know how it feels physically. The adrenaline starts pumping, your heart beats faster. It's very good at keeping us physically safe. But the problem for us in political terms is that social or political things that we perceive as threatening can also fire up fight, flight, freeze. And when that happens, it has all kinds of emotional impacts too. Makes us more overwhelmed, more anxious. We're focusing on our individual interests or our in-group's interests, not on the common good. So we're really interested in alternative ways of responding when we feel threatened, partly in our own minds. And this is where things like mindfulness training can be very effective at allowing us to choose not to respond through fight, flight, freeze, but through a more kind of considered, reflective response. But there's also kind of collective equivalents of that. Psychologists talk about a threat response called tend and befriend, which we're really intrigued by, which is where we tend to ourselves and our immediate kind of family and friendship circles, but then we befriend others to build wider social networks to help us do that. And there's really interesting examples of what that can look like in change making. The fourth big question in our work is all about how we can, as change makers, help communities to navigate crisis. Because obviously we're living through a moment when all kinds of crises are flying at us, whether it's climate breakdown or wars in Ukraine or Yemen, or the cost of living crisis at home, or just what we see when we scroll through social media. Again, it's overwhelming. It makes us feel burned out and exhausted. And what's especially dangerous here is that when communities feel a sort of sense of loss, that kind of loss that Donald Trump spoke to with his catchline of "Make America Great Again," that sense of loss, when it's not mourned for, can be very powerful in the hands of a destructive leader. So kind of working through these periods of crisis and mourning experiences of collective loss is really important at this point. And we think that's going to become a core skill for change makers in the 21st century, to sort of help communities through loss, through trauma, in constructive, healing ways. And then fifth and finally, we're really interested in how change makers can tell the kinds of stories that bring people together rather than dividing them. Because the thought that particularly animates us here is the sense that stories can so easily become self-fulfilling prophecies. Think about what happens when you see a run on a bank, where the story starts to circulate that there isn't enough money, and then people start to behave accordingly. They queue up outside the bank, and suddenly a story has become reality. And in moments of kind of turbulence and breakdown, like the one we're living through now, there's such a risk of the wrong stories taking hold, stories of division and of othering and so forth, which is why it's vitally important that the kind of stories that we're putting out there about ourselves, about this moment that we're in, about the movements that we're part of, are stories that bring us together, stories of a larger us, stories of a longer now, stories of a kind of different good life, where growth is less about how much we consume and more about growth in our kind of maturity and our kindness as societies. So those really...
One minute left.
Right, yeah, I'm wrapping up. So those really briefly are 5 questions that we're very interested in and that we explore kind of in our programs and at gatherings of our community and in the research work we do. And the last thing I'll say is just that these are huge questions and we do not pretend to have neat answers to them. On the contrary, we think the more of us are engaged in the search for answers, the better our chance of actually finding them. And that's why Larger Us is a community. And if you'd be interested in getting involved, we'd absolutely love to see you at one of our events. And I think the link for that is about to come up in the chat. So I'll stop there. Thanks so much again for the invitation to join you.
Thank you so much, Alex. That's really, really helpful, really wonderful sharings. And yeah, I think that one of our colleagues is indeed going to put Morella's just put the link in the chat to your events coming up. So I would love to, what we're going to do is just ask one or two questions to Alex now, but we are going to have a kind of larger Q&A session with all the speakers at the end. If there's any questions that you have specifically for Alex or in general that we might include in our later Q&A, please do share them in the chat box. As I think my colleague Roger said in the chat box, if you put a Q or a question in front of a question, then it helps our team to just pick out amongst the chat the questions coming up. But as people are reflecting on what you've shared, Alex, I'm just going to come in with an initial question around, I think it's, the questions that you've raised and the way that you've framed it is so powerful. And it can, like you say, go against a lot of the ways of that kind of even non-profits and the third sector does tend to communicate, because it could often we can inadvertently fall into the us and them thinking. Sometimes that can, the question is, can that ever be helpful or supportive or powerful, or is that always counterproductive?
I mean, it's a great question. And I think that, there are definitely some people who would argue that it's okay to polarize if you then clean up the mess afterwards. Saul Alinsky, the great kind of, veteran grassroots campaigner who wrote a book called Rules for Radicals, his 13th rule for radical explicitly says, pick the target, freeze it, personalize it, and polarize it. Because in a way, when you do that, it kind of can clarify an issue. And I think that sometimes that can be helpful, but the risk is that when it becomes about othering particular people or whole groups of people, the risk is that that actually makes our work harder rather than easier. And I think that a really useful distinction for me is that, I'm now, invariably wary of othering people, even if it's a kind of leader, someone like Donald Trump, because, even if that individual deserves the othering, there'll be loads of people that support that leader that will feel othered if we other them in what we say. So I think Nelson Mandela made a really valuable distinction that, we need to other systems rather than people. It's absolutely fine to call out unjust systems like white supremacy in the context of the struggle against apartheid. But he made a very clear distinction between doing that and not making enemies out of an entire people, because these are people that ultimately we need to win over in order to succeed.
I think that's really important, and it's kind of like focus on the structures, and there's that old saying like hate the sin, not the sinner, and it's kind of focusing on the actions, the structures, but not othering the people behind it. So thank you, Alex. I think what we're going to do in order to have a lot of time later for the group Q&A, we're going to now move on to the next speaker. But thank you so much, Alex. And Alex will be coming back for your questions, so feel free to keep popping them in the chat. But for now, I'm going to hand over to Georgie to introduce our next speaker.
Thanks, Flo. Thank you, Alex. After a successful teaching career in state schools, Ruth founded Reclaim, a Manchester-based charity supporting working-class young people into leadership positions. CEO for 11 years, she campaigned nationally with young people and their communities for greater levels of equality and to remove the stigma faced by many disadvantaged communities. She also founded the Roots programme, an initiative to bring influencers from vastly different communities together, to learn from each other and increase levels of compassion in our leaders. She was named by Virgin as one of the top 6 women changemakers globally and is an Ashoka Fellow. Ruth, thank you so much for speaking with us today.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for that lovely, very kind introduction. I'm speaking to you all from Bradford in West Yorkshire, not so far from Alex, as I've just found out. And I believe I've got about 10 minutes to talk to you about my thoughts and experiences around these issues, of which I care very deeply. I suppose the first thing to say is a lot of this is a very personal story. I thought about the fact that, we're experts in this field, and in some ways I thought I'm going to bring my lived experience to this. So I'm going to talk to you, just as Alex said, actually storytelling is key. So that's what I'm going to do. Just decided, changed my mind what I'm going to talk about. I'm going to tell you a story. So the first thing to mention is that my background is that my parents are Nigerian. My dad arrived here in short shorts when he was 11 years old on a boat. And, you know, I was all their hopes and dreams, first Nigerian child in rural West Yorkshire. And because of that, I had a pretty difficult, very strange upbringing. And this whole title of us and them, I've always felt both us and them. I had that experience of being a black child growing up in a wholly white environment and being in one place and being one thing, and then necessarily having to put on a different form of myself and go home and be someone else. And it's always been really, really interesting to me because, you know, as soon as I stepped back home, you know, the culture was West African completely. And then I'd step back out and have to almost become someone else. And sometimes having those kind of dual identities can be wonderful, and I love it completely. And other times it gives me an opportunity to choose. So there are times in Britain when I am wholly flag waving. You know, I remember the 2012 Olympic ceremony, you know, I was waving the flag. I was more or less Rule Britannia. Loved it because I felt bought into that vision. Eurovision on Saturday night, the Eurovision Song Contest, Britain, the UK did very well. Again, flag waving. Windrush scandals, sending people to Rwanda because they haven't got the right papers, not so much. Choose to be very, very West African Nigerian woman at that point. So this really, I'm going to talk to you about is my own personal story in terms of finding peace with kind of multiple identities, but also that idea of finding kind of hope in how those two things can merge and how I can avoid being us and them. And also to really embrace sometimes what the shadow sides of that are, because while it can be wonderful and celebratory, also if we're all very honest with ourselves, once you get into that shadow side, we all have our prejudices, we all have people that we prefer to be around, we all have those people who feel evidently comfortable. Even when I was filling in that poll at the start and it said, do you spend more time around people you feel comfortable with? I was about to just say yes, and then I thought, oh, I probably shouldn't, and I went for the middle one instead, right? Because the story I like to tell about myself is someone who is equally comfortable around anyone. In reality, is that so much case? So a bit like Alex, I'm going to reference Brexit because it's very important in this story in terms of being here in the UK. And my work was very much that I worked in working class areas of the country in the north of England. I lived in those areas. You know, they were the communities that I knew and the families that I felt very close to. But my work as a CEO took me to London a lot of the time to work with other CEOs in far more kind of middle class professional spaces. And I went to bed on the night of the referendum, pretty sure that by a whisker, Remain would do it, and then woke up in the morning. And on my street, which was in a kind of fairly working class part of Stockport, the men on the street who never spoke to me were doing the conga at 5 o'clock in the morning, literally congering down the road. And it was jubilant. It was like a street party. And I went to the window and I was like, what is going on? We were not that kind of community. My neighbour, who used to ignore me, was shouting Happy Independence Day. It was genuinely the happiest day on my street. And then obviously I realised why. And that was that. The next day, I had to speak at an event in London. It was an event at the Branson Health thing in Virgin, and it was like a funeral had taken place. And literally, I was speaking on stage, and I was trying to talk about, you know, pride in the north of England, and I was almost heckled off of the stage. And as people were getting drunker, people were talking about, you know, some communities are too stupid to vote. They should just take the vote away from them. They're effing morons. And I came away from that just thinking, wow, you know, there you've got two communities of people who are 2.5 hours away on a train, who know absolutely nothing of each other, who've never stepped into each other's shoes, who have made all kinds of decisions about each other without ever spending time in each other's lives or wanting to, having any curiosity about the other. So from that point, I then started up something called the Roots program. And Roots was very much about how do you find people from very different parts of the same country who have different socioeconomic backgrounds, maybe geographical, maybe age, and bring them together to have curious and compassionate and connected episodes with each other. to listen to each other, to not have those who've got the degrees and those who've had more advantage in life come along to listen and learn from others, but to have it both ways. Because how often do we, quite often as professionals, have an opportunity to go into poorer communities and spend time with them and learn from them? But how often do we have the humility and the vulnerability to invite those people back to look at our lives and to see what they feel about us and the choices that we've made as well? And so Roots is very much about that. How do we encourage people to kind of dial down the toxic us and them narrative and instead just embrace something, be a bit vulnerable, step into something, just listen, just learn, just appreciate difference. We've come to a point where difference is something, like Alex was saying, there's so much fear attached to it. You know, I grew up in a house where, to be honest, I think because my dad and mum were so happy to be here, you know, every weekend we'd be off. My mum's favourite book was How Green Are My Valleys. We used to go to the Welsh Valleys. We went to the Highlands of Scotland. I've got so many photos of myself as a child, you know, in hugely unlikely spaces, because there was that natural curiosity. And I think it's really, really important that we just see that people who are different to us have probably got reasons. No one makes choices to make their own children more unhappy. But even if that ends up being the case, no one does that. So the thing that really inspired me to start Roots was the fact that at the time when the referendum happened and everyone felt like they were in shock, it just felt like our leadership didn't really have the skill to try and knit things back together. It felt like a time when we needed compassion and we needed care, and we needed as a country to be really held close and told it was going to be all right. And instead we didn't get any of that. So Roots is very, very much about how do we find people who can spend time with each other. I've just seen your point, Rona, in the chat. People who can spend time with each other and people who can just listen and appreciate that life can be different and that's all right, and that other people's lives are just as valid. And what's really interesting is we also run the Roots programme for young people in the state sector, in school sector, and in the private school sector. Because actually, you know, we have a very tiered society and it starts off at school. And part of the problem is that some of the schools in the UK are for some children and they have different curriculums and they're hidden behind fences, and those children do not mix with the children who are in state schools or who are from council estates until the point that they become professionally more senior to them in life. So we actually get the children together to spend time with each other, to understand that there's so much commonality, to understand that life as a 13-year-old can be difficult wherever you're from and whatever your life might be. So one thing I wanted to just talk about, and I know I've not got much time left, is the fact that I think it's really important that when we're in these spaces that we also work really hard to think about who's not here and to double down our efforts to invite those people in. Because when I knew that I'd been kind of booked to speak at this, I went to speak to some of my friends who live in Halifax, on an estate just outside Halifax, and which is, you know, not too far from here. And I asked them about, you know, their views on us and them, and the amount of eye rolling that went on from the friends in that pub, and the idea that no one's really bothered about what they think, and they get consulted but no one really cares. And quite a few of those people in that room had voted Brexit. And when I asked them why, they said, you know, to make people squirm. And that's a really uncomfortable thing to hear, a really uncomfortable thing to hear. But I think that we need to do more to unpick that and to make people feel part of things and to make people feel loved and included in whatever grand story we're telling about the future. If it's going to be progressive, then everyone needs to be taken along on the ride. And at the moment, it feels that some of us are along on the ride and those that are left behind are just really left behind. So for me, I suppose I'm here. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm living in a country that's obsessed with being the best at everything. You know, we're world beaten at this and world beaten at that. Actually, I would love it if we had an aim to be world beaten at something, but it was being good at being different. If we were to actually look at the differences that we've got in our small country and said, you know what, we're going to do this well. So for me, that's the kind of the end of this. There's something about us and them working together. Oh, look at that, right in time. Us and them working together and doing differently better. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruth. So our question for you is, how do you deal with the complexity of benefiting from systems which perpetuated colonialism and racism? And the person who asked this has said, big for me as a BIPOC person. Yeah, as a BIPOC person.
Hello, thank you for that question. Just give me the first part of that question again, Flo. In terms of benefit.
How do you deal with the complexity of benefiting from systems which perpetuated colonialism and racism?
Yeah, it is complex and it is heavy. And I found myself for a while really floundering, trying to prosper within those systems. But I now find it's a bit of the us and them, isn't it? I find that my ideal thing is to disrupt those systems. All I want to do constantly. And I used to just expend all my energy in that disruptive space. And actually I disrupted nothing apart from myself. So now I tend to have a kind of bottom up, top down approach to that kind of systems work, in that I'm working alongside people in communities that feel of places of strength, people who kind of look and sound like me. I spend a lot of time in those communities because that's where I get my kind of strength and nourishment to keep going on and to keep galvanizing. But I also spend quite a bit of time doing the kind of top-down work and working with those people who kind of want to be good allies, but maybe have not got a clue how to do it. So I think it's about just ensuring that your roots are really nourished and you're spending enough time with those people who do that. But at the same time, in order to change those systems, you need to find those people who can work alongside you, who've got that kind of influence within those systems.
Thank you so much, Ruth, for sharing all those insights and your personal experiences. That was so enriching and helpful. So thank you.
Thank you.
Flo, over to you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Ruth. And yeah, I feel like there's such a rich sharing from you and reflections and comments in the chat box, and we would love to bring in more questions as we go through, so feel free to keep sharing. But for now, I'm going to introduce our third and final speaker of the evening, which is George Marshall. So George is the founder of Climate Outreach, which is a climate change communications and training charity, and his 20 years experience in environmental campaigning includes government policy consultations and senior management positions in Greenpeace and the Rainforest Foundation. And he speaks and writes widely on climate change issues, including articles for the New Statesman, The Guardian, New Scientist and The Ecologist. And he's also the author of 2 books, one of which is called Don't Even Think About It, Why Our Brains Are Wired to Ignore Climate Change, which examines our complex psychological responses to climate change. So really looking forward to hearing George's perspective on the issues of the evening. Over to you, George.
Thank you so much. I'm actually genuinely really humbled following you, Ruth and Alex, and you just put this so well. I hope that I can do even begin to do as well as both of you. I wanted to start by saying why do I think that this issue is so important? This issue of us and them. Well, I work on climate change and in this issue, but not just in this issue and many issues, but in this issue particularly, polarization has been absolutely catastrophic. It has destroyed the international process, not completely destroyed, it still carries forward, but it has absolutely destroyed the international process. It has destroyed the process in many of the world's major polluting countries. And it has made that distant goal of trying to reach a sustainable future just ever constantly over the horizon. And I've done a lot of work in America, in Australia, and in Canada, and so on. In the US, when I was writing my book, I spent quite a lot of time hanging out with and interviewing people on what we would call the far right, let's say the libertarian right. I spent some time with the Texan Tea Party, which was quite an eye-opener. And listening, and I'm going to come back to this point at the end, like listening, I really see it as a radical action to go and spend time with people who have different views to my own. And I see myself as a radical. And it's not easy, and it requires a degree of bravery on their part as well as yourself to open up to you and for you to go and listen to them. But what was interesting for me about the Tea Party was, well, one thing, to be honest, what was interesting was that the Texan Tea Party was considerably more diverse than my own organization, or most green groups I've been in, ethnically diverse. But also what was interesting was that actually their views should have been involved with climate change. They were passionate about policy. They were passionate in many ways about the environment. They were strongly anti-corporate, but they had become caught in this polarized divide where they thought that climate change was a complete myth, something which had been imposed on them from the other side. And I guess this is one of the things which had me thinking, well, how did this situation emerge? Because it could very easily have been the other way around. Why is it that when Donald Trump comes to power, he decides to oppose action on climate change when previously, some years previously, he'd been supporting it? He was going where the wind blew. Why did it blow that way? And I guess, well, one thing to say is I explore in my book that to some degree, this kind of polarization is innate. So when I was filling in that poll and we were saying, like, do you spend most of your time with people like yourself? Well, the answer, of course, is yes. We all do. We all do. It's what we do. We spend our time with people who are like ourselves. And that's fundamentally built into human nature. And not only do we do that, but we're constantly in negotiation of the world around us, either consciously or subconsciously scanning the world around us so that we are in tune, not just tune, but we're in harmony with the people around us. Because as humans, the most disastrous thing that can happen for us is to be excluded from our tribe. So if we have a choice between believing or being seen to believe something that actually we think is wrong, or holding on to our belief and being rejected from our tribe, from our social group, we will always tend to do the former. And that's fundamental to the process which happens over this polarization. One of the things which happens in social psychology is that there's a process by which people actively and deliberately suppress their own views in order to maintain their part of a norm. What they also do is they consistently and seriously underestimate the views of the groups around them. They would say that the group around them, for example, on my issue, climate change, people on conservatives totally underestimate the number of fellow conservatives who are concerned about climate change, because they are all trying to reach this kind of harmonic convergence where they all appear to share the same views. So we tend to identify with our own group. We tend therefore, as part of that, to oppose other people. We tend to say this is us, and then we can get into this antagonism towards others. Now, what happened with climate change, which was worse, was that this process was accelerated and amplified by the way that it was moved forward by the environmental movement, within which I am a lifelong and very proud member. But I realize now that one of the things we did was we never paid attention towards building bridges with other groups. What we tended to do is we tended to speak to people like ourselves in our own language. And we had a disastrous strategy, which I would call vanguardism, which comes from a kind of like a left-wing activism, that if you can be loud enough in a small group, if you can be very targeted as a small group, but passionate and strategic, you can make the change happen. And there's this hideous Margaret Mead quote, which appears all over the place. In fact, I even brought it up on my computer here. Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has. Well, first thing is, she never said that. There's no evidence that Margaret Mead ever said that, or any reference place that I could ever find for her saying that. But secondly, that's not true. That is not the only thing that has ever changed the world. The only thing which has ever changed the world has actually been creating consensus across society and shared views. And it might start with a small group of dedicated people, but it only becomes change when that group reaches out and builds across societal support. So now, and this is further amplified, and I'm going to flag it up now because we might have an interesting discussion about it, by the obsession of people on the progressive movement, with whom I identify in so many ways with what they would call intersectionality. The idea that these different struggles can all be combined into one mega struggle against the oppression of capitalism, the patriarchy, and the forces that hold power. Now, politically, I agree with a lot of the analysis, but strategically, it's disastrous, as I saw in the States. Because what happens is you get a cluster of views that says, this is us. And then you got people who, looking at that, just go, well, I don't like that, but because the whole thing is clustered, they move to the other extreme. So, for example, in the US, people have bumper stickers, or for elections, they put things out on their front lawn saying pro-abortion, Black Lives Matter, climate change, control guns, like basically the whole string list. And climate change, because it's fallen into that, has become just as severely polarized. It is very, very hard in the US to be a Republican holding strong views in support of climate action, because of the way that all of these things have become deliberately and I think dangerously intertwined. And when I was in New York one time, there was a march of 10,000 people marching through the streets of New York, calling for climate action, like a big, big protest march. Not one single banner there was saying Republicans for climate action. There was a lot saying, you know, smash capitalism. Nothing for that. But I met some ranchers who'd come down from Nevada they were campaigning against the Keystone XL pipeline, and I said, you know, it would have been so great if you guys had stood out there and said Republicans for climate action. And they just said, are you kidding? There is no way we could do that. Well, that's half the population alienated from that process. So let me come on and say, what do we need? Like, what do we need from that? Well, I think we have to recognize and respect true diversity. And I think what's very interesting is within the progressive side of the people I work with, we're extremely selective with our definition of diversity. It's basically, we like diversity when it's people who in various ways align with our worldview and align with our values. We are very uncomfortable with diversity when it's people who might challenge us or might have a different point of view. We're also, because this is the British poison and this is the dark side, we're extremely bad around class as well. So like we will, and especially politics. So like if I ask activists, do we have a problem with diversity? They will always pick on the ones, quite rightly, by the way, I'm not judging this in any way, concerning, you know, ethnicity and color and disability and these issues. Class, they'll get there in the end. It'll take a little while. Politics, not at all. They won't even mention the issue of diversity of politics because it's a black hole. It's something which isn't talked about. So I think in our own lives, we need to be thinking, are we actively involved? Are we actively engaging and reaching out wide? Are we listening? I mean, I'm doing a lot of talking now, but in my work, I do a huge amount of listening. In my Instagram feed, I follow all the left-wing people. You know, and I might be following Jeremy Corbyn, I might be following People's Momentum, and I'm also following Tucker Carlson and the National Rifles Association. The algorithm on Instagram doesn't know what to do with me or what to sell to me. It's completely confused. It sells me cat food most of the time. I've got no idea where to place me because I don't fit into any of their boxes. But like, we've got to be open to that with a passionate belief that there are ideas that can be taken from different places and that everybody has a contribution to make. I think that's a really important thing. Everybody on all of these major issues has to feel that there's something, that they are valued, that they're respected, and that there's something that they can offer on this. So I think we need kind of like two stories. We need a story of togetherness, this sense that we need to collaborate, that we're strong for that, and true diversity, that in diversity is strength. We don't have to be the same. We might disagree, we might bicker, there might be tension there should be, but through that we get wisdom. But we need to come together, that there's issues that bring us together. And then I think we need a story of each group having its own story. And I'm slightly over time, so I'll stop now. But just to say, in my own work in climate outreach, which I founded 14 years ago, from the very beginning, we were saying, how do we build a story of climate change for different groups such that they feel that they have a part to play? And that means we need to actively encourage and enable people to feel that their voice is there, can be heard, but it's their story. It's not someone else's story. We're not a part of something else. It's theirs. So, you know, I spent some time a while ago working with oil workers in Alberta, who are like extremely hard audience to work with, to develop their story of climate change and how they could speak to it. And that became something that was strong for them. I guess the final point on this was, Ruth and Alex, you've both raised issues of your own position, is just to say, for me too, this is a personal story. I've had the privilege of coming from a very mixed background where one side of my family were in the British Army and another side of the family were coal miners. Seeing it from both points of view, spending time with both communities, a bit like you were saying, Ruth, that sense of shifting between these two worlds and hugely benefiting from that as well, like feeling the strength that both traditions have to bring. So I think, yeah, I've talked a lot. I'll stop now.
Thank you so much, George. Really interesting and powerful points made. And I think you've raised a lot of points that could be picked up in further discussion together with Alex and Ruth and in our wider Q&A. Yeah, I would love, well, if anyone's got any specific questions for George, feel free to share them in the chat, and or any questions for all speakers in general, because we're going to move to our wider Q&A shortly. Yeah, I would love to ask your kind of experiences at Climate Outreach, and maybe some lessons that you've learned and how they kind of transfer into kind of practical tips that people could embed into their day-to-day work, their day-to-day lives.
So on the one hand, what I would say is that when we do our research and we work with people, stories which are powerful stories start with pride and validation. If they start with saying we're important, we're worthwhile, and we really have something to contribute, we're proud of who we are. And I think an awful lot of environmental stories start with blame. They start with saying we're bad, we're dirty, we're disgusting, we're destroying the world. That sort of that. So people need to feel strong, and the marginalized groups, the ones who are less a part of the conversation and need to be, are often the ones who are already insecure and already vulnerable. And so anything which makes them feel stronger and supported is really important. We've done a lot of work with segmentation in society, of like saying, okay, there are these different values groups, and the ones who are hard to reach, the ones who are disengaged and they feel disempowered. So I think there has to be that. I think something that we would also stress very strongly is that people as change activists underestimate the huge importance of conversations and interpersonal exchange. And something that we've been very keen to stress is actually probably one of the most useful and powerful things you can do about climate change is talk about it. For a long time, there's been a collective silence. That's something maybe that might be interesting for, for Ruth and Alex to explore. The degree to which there's conflict, we know that, but also the degree to which there's a silence, there's a gap in the conversation. People don't want to go there, so they simply pull away, and we have huge areas of discourse which are just where people are scared to go. That happens very much in families. I mean, we know it happened over Brexit. That happens over a lot of these contentious issues, but people just go, okay, there's a force field around it, so we're not even going to go there. So how can we have non-violent, listening, meaningful disagreements about things? And how can we talk about things in an interactive way? I think is hugely important. I think really, if we're going to move forward on climate change as an issue, we need to be having that at every level, in families, friendship groups, in the workplace, and the community.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you, George. So there's lots of really interesting questions pouring in the chat box. But I think before we delve into further questions, we want to offer you guys an opportunity to connect with each other, actually. So we thought that we would give a short chance to go into breakout rooms and just connect with other people that are on this at this event, and share your reflections on what the speakers have talked about so far, and maybe just reflect together, are there questions that you would like to raise that maybe haven't been fully addressed, or that you'd like to hear each of the speakers' views on. So we'll be going into breakout rooms of about between 5 to 7 people, and it will be for just under 10 minutes, and then we'll come back all together, and you'll have the chance to ask further questions and share further comments with the speakers, and the speakers will also have the chance to reflect on what each other have shared as well. So welcome you to go into the breakout rooms, and then please if you can have your cameras on. We won't be recording the breakout rooms. Please unmute yourself and participate in the discussion if you can. If you'd prefer not to, that's totally okay. You're welcome to stay in the main room.
There are no captions in the breakout rooms. There are no captions in the breakout rooms.
There are no captions in the breakout rooms. Thank you. So yeah, that's also a very important point, and thank you for sharing. There's no captions in the breakout room. So if you need any support with captions, then again, feel free to stay in the main room, and we might end up having a small chat in the main room as well. Any further questions or comments on the practicalities of the breakout rooms before we go into them? If you do have any issues, feel free to just send a message, and there's plenty of us around to be able to help you. So I'll move you into those breakout rooms now, and we'll see you back in here in just under 10 minutes or so.
we're all staying out of.
So welcome back those joining on the recording. So yeah, really helpful responses, and also some interesting questions coming as a result of discussions had in the breakout rooms. So Anya has asked that in her breakout room discussion that they talked about bridging divides, needing a kind of gentle approach, and also taking time, actually really taking time and effort and energy. And the question is, what does this mean for activism? So should activism take completely different forms to protest, civil disobedience, or do we need both? And we'd love to hear from the whole panel of speakers on that question, whoever would like to join in first.
I'll answer. I saw the question in the chat, and I thought it was a really beautiful question, actually. I think the answer is both. I think you need those large dramatic moments and those large dramatic actors sometimes to be up there leading things and to be making those speeches that inspire us all. Just following on from what George was saying before, I feel that part of the issue at the moment is there are not enough people kind of illustrating in a visionary way what a positive future could look like, what a more hopeful future could look like, and we all can't do that. That's not the place for everyone to do that. But I think you do need those big moments, and sometimes it's civil disobedience, sometimes it's a great speech, a hugely charismatic individual, but most people can't be that. And so at Roots, for example, my colleague Claire, who's on this call, the actual bringing people together is such a gentle process. It allows everyone to step into it. You're baking some shortbread together online. You're making a short film of what you can see from your doorstep and exchanging it with a stranger. You're sharing a day diary. You're doing really small things are bringing you closer together to understanding someone's experience. It might not feel like activism, but for many people, this is a way they can step into making a change. Even the word activism, for some people, they're like, that's not me. But actually, it's quite a strong, radical step to commit to difference and commit to embracing difference. So yeah, we do take very gentle, small human steps because we think that's the way to create the change.
Love that, Ruth. Thank you so much. It reminds me of like the creativity that some people bring into like gentle forms of activism. And George, over to you.
I'm going to totally agree with Ruth on this. We need all of this. There's multiple tactics. I think that that change. If we have a theory of change, it's recognizing that actually it's achieved because there's levels of activity happening across the spectrum. That there are people who are playing an inside game, and there's people who are playing a very low, gentle game, and then there's disruptors. Someone I saw was asking, what do I think of XR? I think XR, I support XR. I've been involved with their protests. They're disruptors. That's their act. That's what's great about the action, is it disrupts, but it's only as effective as there being other people who are then having maybe much calmer conversations within their own communities and within the policy process and so on. And the thing I can't stand is when in social change movements, different parts of it don't recognize or respect the role played by others. So for many years, I've known that people who are involved in policy work say, you direct action people going out there chaining yourself to things, you're totally destroying the conversation we're trying to have in here. And it's like, no, we're not, we're supporting it. And we have similar contempt for them of saying, you're just a bunch of sellouts, we need transformation. It's like, no. Actually, we're all part of the same process. The thing I was going to add is also that I think that there's a real role to building on what you were saying, Ruth. There's a real opportunity for building conversations where people already come together. So where there's already something gentle and sharing going on. I'm particularly interested with faith communities, which is one of the places where sometimes people of different worldviews and politics and experience come together because they share a faith. And then you can have a conversation between people. And there's lots of ways that people come together. So I really don't think that the only or even necessarily the best way of reaching people is through groups convened for an issue. I think sometimes a great way of doing it is because they're coming together for something else. And so they already have that sense of togetherness through the shared activity around which you can have that narrative togetherness.
Wonderful, thank you, George. And Alex, anything you'd like to add on this?
I think, in the activist context, I guess it can be helpful to think of it as that there's two different but related challenges that we face. The first is how can we avoid adding to the polarization that already exists, and in some cases falling into the trap that's being set for us, where we're being invited to polarize. And, you know, I mean, I think two examples of how we can do that. One is when we set purity tests as a condition for sort of being part of a movement. I mean, a friend of mine who's a veteran campaigner was at the Glasgow Climate Summit last year, and there was someone there from PETA, the vegetarian group, who was with a big placard saying, "Shut up about climate change if you eat meat." And I completely understand the sentiment, but it's so unhelpful if we want to be welcoming people in to a movement, inviting people in. So I think that's one example. And the other is when we're doing forms of activism that alienate people that we need to win over. And I do think that some of the actions that Insulate Britain, for example, were taking of kind of blocking traffic, just annoyed the hell out of people rather than winning them over. And there were alternative ways of sort of, you know, engaging people. But then on the flip side, I mean, that's the sort of let's not make polarization worse. But then I think the flip side is, what can we do to bridge those divides? And, you know, one example that I adore, which I sort of mentioned in the chat, is this technique that's been pioneered in the United States called deep canvassing. And this is something that really came out of the equal marriage movement. And it involves, I mean, you know, traditional election canvassing. You figure out who's likely to vote for you, and then you identify them and make sure they do turn out to vote on polling day. Deep canvassing turns all of that on its head. You identify people who passionately disagree with you, and then you engage them respectfully in doorstep conversations, which involve a lot of listening, a lot of open-ended questions, some emotional disclosure from your own side, absolutely no throwing facts and arguments at them, definitely no calling out. And there's really strong evidence now to show that, you know, it's blooming hard work. It takes a long time to train activists to do this, and the conversations take a long time as well. But it does work. You can have sort of genuine encounter in these conversations. And it's been so powerful in the US, as I say, in the context of LGBTQ issues, never been tried here, as far as I know, in the context of climate activism. But imagine if that's the sort of thing that were happening, whether it's with XR affinity groups or Friends of the Earth climate action groups, if they were fanning out across communities and just having these kind of conversations. If we want the sort of consensus across the political spectrum that George was talking about, that feels like a really valuable place to start.
Can I just add a thing on that? By the way, just one side thing was I was talking with XR about what they might like to do, and I said, well, something that would be great is actually if your priority for the next project is inviting people to bring along someone who had never been involved with anything like this before. And that's actually the activism. The activism isn't even what you do, it's bringing someone else along. But I also wanted to say that isn't just a strategy, it's also can be transformative for the activists. And I guess the thing that I'd say is, from myself, from my activist experience, the point at which I started in my work stepping out of the safety zone of the people like me and sitting down with people who I fundamentally disagreed with and who could really challenge me was a transformative moment for me. You know, and I mean, I guess now I love focus groups. I've spent hundreds of hours just sitting and just listening, asking a question, pulling back and being open to what people say. So I'd say that it's something I'd really encourage everybody to do in your own lives as part of, if there's anyone on this call who's a social change activist, as part of your practice, just be out there and just ask people questions. Don't seek to bully them or batter them with facts. Just be open to what they might say, listen and learn.
Thank you all so much. I'd like to ask if any of our speakers or all of our speakers have any closing remarks or reflections. We've got a few minutes, and Flo and I want to share a few details before we end the event. But yes, over to you if there's any final thoughts.
When George was speaking then, I was just reminded of one of my most beautiful days of work ever, when I was working with young people from social housing across the north of England who wanted to work to kick the stigma out of the term working class. And they decided to go and have a campaign and talk to people from different social classes. And they went to London, and they decided to go to the banking area of London. And each of them went and had a conversation with a banker. And they talked to them about where they live and why there was no shame in being poor. and they talked to them about their lives, and they asked if they'd known anyone who lived in social housing, and it was remarkable, absolutely remarkable how many people, how many of those bankers were completely thrown up and didn't know what to do, and next minute they sat down on a park bench having a conversation with a young person who had a completely different life to them. And I just think if there was just a bit more courage in reaching out, as those 12-year-old boys showed on that day, to people who are completely different to us and showing a bit of ourselves, I think we would be in a much better place much faster.
I don't have any sort of way of summing it up. It's been such a rich discussion, but just a sort of closing thought from me is something that gives me a lot of hope is there's an organization called More in Common who work to kind of bridge divides. They've done amazing research actually together with Climate Outreach, but they do a lot of private opinion polling, and something that one of their staff mentioned to me a couple of years back, which I found so interesting, was just in the wake of Brexit and all these other sort of divides, the rise of the far right in Europe and everything, they found in this private polling that there was such enormous appetite, not just in Britain, but in France and Germany and other countries too, for some kind of big national project that we could all be part of. There was real, a fire in people's bellies for something that would bring us together to build something big and new. And they also found in that polling that the single strongest contender for what area such a project might be about was nature. Not environment, not climate change. Those are frames that are seen as owned by the left, but nature really fires people up. And I just found that such a surprising and encouraging finding. I never would have predicted that that was what would come out of their polling, but that's what it was.
That's so wonderful to hear, Alex, especially because nature is an issue that is something that is close to the hearts of the Network of Wellbeing and Resurgence hosting this event. So wonderful point to close on. George, just over to you if you have any final thoughts.
Very little, because the others have said it all so clearly. I think just to say that recognizing that overcoming this is not just about goodwill, but it's actually about process. I was thinking about with like what you were saying, Ruth. Like, we have to have processes of building bridges. We have to enable it. It's partly about allowing the space for different points of view and genuinely doing it and listening. I think it's about stepping back, and this is certainly something that I've welcomed from the recent discourse, that as somebody who is overrepresented because of my background and my color and being a white man, I very much welcome the idea, and now often do just step back and just say, okay, no, you don't need me on this, and allow the space for other people. But I think that needs to be done in a much more courageous and broad way. And I think it's also about allowing, this is a much harder issue, but allowing mixing into the infrastructure of our lives somehow. And I haven't got a clear answer for this, but it's got to be something about really allowing social mixing, enabling the places and the institutions and the mechanisms by which that happens. We're so siloed. So how can we make that possible? And I think there are ways of doing it, but they need to be quite deliberately created.
Thank you so much. Thank you, George. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you, Alex. And thank you all so much for being here together with us. I think this is a learning edge for me, a learning edge for us all in our own ways. And we're all, it's been so enriching to hear the perspectives of people so actively working on bridging divides. So thank you. We wanted to share very briefly just a few that, like we mentioned at the start, the Hope in Action is a series of events. So next event will be actually in September. So we're just doing a few a year at the moment, looking at practices of embodying hope in action. So really welcome to join us then. And we're going to be sending a follow-up email with a link to the recording and also other further Hope in Action articles, and we've even got a retreat coming up next year. So yeah, please do stay engaged, stay in touch, and yeah, just to say a huge thanks again to everyone for being here. Georgie, anything else you'd like to add before we say goodbye?
No, big thanks to our speakers and to everyone who's gathered here. I hope that this serves. And go well.
Thanks all.
Thanks all.
Take care. Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.